Well, what a nice crowd, thank you. Should we wait for the stragglers? Nah. I hear you, you're all here, right? Well, here we are, my brief series this year, 2 talks, one next week on Vicente, but let's start with Joaquín Sorolla, just an absolutely fascinating artist about whom I knew very little to start out. I would say there are so many extraordinary comparisons between Sorolla and our own dear William Merritt Chase that I'll go into that a bit in this talk. From the exhibition, I hope you've had a chance to see it, are some just absolutely beautiful, very late, it turned out to be very late in Sorolla's life. He had sort of worked all his whole career to be able to build a house in Madrid, then on the outskirts. He thought it was going to be very quiet. He said, I loved it because there were nothing but goats in the neighborhood and goat herds roaming. It now is, of course, in the center of the city, central Madrid, but he really wanted his whole life to have that home with his family, and the great passions were his art, his family, and his Spanish heritage. So I have this 2 portraits, very young. They're not exactly in the same category of age. Chase was born in 1849 in Indiana. He died in 1916 in New York. Sorolla was born in 1863 in a small town in Valencia, and he died in 1923 right there in Madrid. So they're not quite a generation, not 20 years, but enough apart in age to have a bit of a different trajectory early in their careers. However, by the time they sort of reached maturity, they were very much on the world stage, both of them, with people like Whistler and Sargent and Zorn. And so we'll talk a bit about that. It's interesting to see that many of their, what we now call core principles, I don't know, you hear that a lot now, core principles, were about looking at similar paintings and similar ideas. So I think there's a big connection between them in that sense. Good? There. This is Chase, who studied I mentioned he was born in Indiana. He painted there. He studied art, but always in the Midwest at that point before he came, of course, back to New York. And he was supported by some businessmen who were eager to. The Midwest, we always have to remember, was where the great fortunes were. I'm going to talk about a Sorolla show that went to Buffalo. We don't always think of Buffalo as West, but it was certainly in the 19th century. It was where the great fortunes were too. So needless to say, the first thing you do if you have a fortune and a house is to get busy furnishing it with beautiful rugs and drapes and paintings. So in Indiana at that point, there was a syndicate group of businessmen who came together and said, young man, you're such a good painter, we'd like to see you go to Europe to study. And of course, Chase famously said, I'd rather go to Europe than go to heaven. And so he went off, a syndicate in the sense that he would, each of those supporters would have a choice of his paintings when they were shipped back to the US. And although everyone thought he should go to Paris, he decided that there was far too much what he called frippery in Paris. And would be a major distraction to any young man from the Midwest who hadn't really seen the world at that point. He decided he'd go to Germany, that he would study at the very famous academy in Munich. And so he did, and Munich just that academy was virtually across the street from the Neue Pinakothek, which was the extraordinary collection of the German princes and principalities brought together there in Munich, and some of the great 16th, 17th, and 18th century painters from all of Europe had worked there. So he was able to see, Velázquez in the flesh whenever he walked over to the Neue Pinakothek. Now, Sorolla, who was born, as I said, 17 years later, he's a young man there. He was not born wealthy. He was quite impoverished as a child, mainly because he was orphaned. Both his parents died. He was brought up by relatives, and he sort of had to make his way. But at a very young age, he was just given to drawing, and that talent was recognized. And by 18, he was given basically a scholarship to the Art Academy in Valencia. So he was there until he studied there about 4 years. Then he went on to Rome, loved Italy, loved the gardens of Italy, and you see a lot of that coming through in his own gardens that he designed at the house in Madrid, which we'll look at. But he also was an art student, in these academies, which, needless to say, they had a little fun. If Chase wanted to skip the frippery of Paris, there's no place like Munich for partying. It has a great reputation, yes, have you been there? Oktoberfest, anyone, which had Frühlingszeit, the Easter, the spring festival. These all holdovers from, of course they became Christian holidays, but they're all holdovers from really pagan rites for spring and for fall. So nothing like the Munich ball there. There's Chase, these are both of Chase in 1872, dressed as a peasant. Very popular attire to sort of look back and do something totally different. On the right is basically a set-up photograph that he would have been in a photo studio, but he has garbed himself as a sailor looking out from the ship and sort of dressed in that an old-timey uniform as well. This was probably a carte de visite, which would have been a small photograph with his name, possibly a way to get in touch with him. Wouldn't have been email, but probably an address in Munich. And so we do have these from the 1870s. He was there for the better part of that decade. He traveled a bit in Europe as well, and certainly went back to Europe over the course of his lifetime. Here he is copying the old Dutch masters, which of course he would have copied in the studio as well. And then this is Sorolla, about in the late 1870s. As a young student, he's too on his way, we assume, to some kind of costume ball, or perhaps he could have been, of course, posing for a fellow student. Anyway, the toreador costume was a very popular one. And Chase, I guess, and he did look quite dashing in that rough collar. So, again, let's look at the house in Madrid. Who's been to the museum and house? Do I see a hand over there? It's quite, much to my regret, I have not been there. It's quite beautiful, isn't it?
Oh,
yeah.
Beautiful. And there's so many of the studies and paintings. And
right.
The studio is just how he left it.
Right. So I did include some pictures for us to look at. What's important is that he really meant this to be his home for his family, where he could work, in proximity to them. He married a young woman from Valencia. Her father was a studio photographer, and Sorolla, as a young man, worked for him, apprenticed with him for a while, which is very interesting when you think about the way his art evolved. But he did finally marry the boss's daughter. They were inseparable, except when he had to go on long, trips, but to the U.S. But by and large, they traveled together always. They had 3 children, and this is the facade. So these are all obviously contemporary photographs there with the leaves down. You can see that very well. So as I said, he wasn't able to start this until after the turn of the century. Really, by 1909, the house had been finished, and he had collected really throughout his whole career as he traveled in Spain and in Italy. He had collected objects that ultimately he wanted to use to decorate his home and studio. On the right he was also very influenced by the Alcazar and the Alhambra, all the great palaces of Muslim Spain, and he loved, of course, the Moorish tiles and collected them, as you'll see. On the right is one of the paintings now the paintings in the exhibition here are all dated 1917, 1 or 2, but majority are from 1919, really. When he was, at that point, he said, if you wanted me to paint your portrait, you could come sit in my garden. He was done with traveling. He really used the home as both his workplace and his home with his children. So roses, of course, identified really with Spain. You always think of the rose in various people's teeth when you think of the toreadores or the wonderful dancers. This was a yellow rose that went trellised all along the portico as you went in, and I don't know if it's apocryphal, but everyone tells the story of this rose really never blooming again after he died. And there it is, you see the family there in the photograph, lower left, and the roses. And there is Mrs. Sorolla. Clotilde is her name. It's a beautiful name, isn't it? Clotilde. And the roses which draped on the fountains, you can see this is the garden on the right that he painted. He called the Italian garden, or Italianate, because it had quite a few sculptures in it. He was quite taken with the way that he saw the gardens in Italy. And of course the garden on the left with this sort of step down and the amphitheater, more. And the painting on the right, of course, of the fountain. This is the interior, the studio, as you can see, beautiful double or triple height there. And this just seems to be one of the porticos that has a bit of the collection. There are many other pictures of these things he collected. That's a man after my own heart. I don't have quite that many, but... Well, William Merritt Chase, let's go back to Mr. Chase, who was another one known for collecting. He, of course, taught here in Shinnecock Hills throughout the 1890s. The first year was 1891. He came out without his family. He stayed in what was the Canoe Place Inn. It's come a long way, baby, hasn't it? They still call it that, don't they? Canoe Place, vestiges of that spot, but he stayed there as a bachelor, and he had really written into his contract. He was asked to come out and found the school. He was the best known teacher, probably in America, certainly in New York. And the women who began this sort of real estate venture, does that surprise you, of bringing an art school to the lovely Shinnecock Hills, picked him above all others, and he did accept. Part of the deal was the next year he would have a home built in the Shinnecock Hills, really up on this beautiful rise, designed by, sort of a house design, but by his friends McKim, Mead, and White. So that was the typical porch, the hipped roof, the Dutch gables that we all know so well, the Gilded Age style that came back again at the end of the 1900s, when all houses again aspired to look like the Gilded Age. This is Mrs. Chase on the right, equally inspiring her husband, as we'll see Madame Sorolla did. This is Alice Judenet Chase in one of the rooms there, sort of assuming the same pose she did in the painting on the wall done by her husband much earlier in her life. A total of 8 children. 4 were born in Shinnecock, and after they had moved there, these are the 4 youngest children. They, Chase, by about 1902, he didn't tire teaching in Shinnecock, but all the people who were, let's say, his clients, or who were the people who would come and study for a summer, most of them very good artists, many were women, and they would sort of have lost interest. It became much more fashionable to go to Europe to study. So Chase, ever on the trail of what was trendy in art, and also in in travel and pedagogy, if you like, began to teach in Europe in the summers, and that's where he really started to collect a lot, when he went to Holland or Spain, or bring back things which you'll see in many of his paintings. I thought it was interesting right there at the Shinnecock house, there's the beautiful roses and that kind of old iron kettle that was used for rendering whale fat that someone collected along the way. Here are 2 self-portraits, a bit later in life, a little more girth there, but that was the style, at least for men. And Sorolla, of course, on the right, both with their palettes. We assume there's a painting that he's working on as well. This would have been in the Shinnecock studio with Chase on the left. Always popular with patrons, as well as with the artists themselves, to do self-portraits. Now, this is a painting from 1892, so we can put the 2 artists sort of in parallel lives here. Chase beginning to teach in Shinnecock in the summers, certainly teaching in New York, the New York School of Art, later the Chase School. This might be surprising, because we think, is it a bit surprising to see this painting from 1892? Certainly different in subject matter, different in palette from what we may typically think of as Sorolla, particularly in some of the work I'll show in a minute. But he was certainly, like Chase, looking at Velázquez, as I mentioned, but also looking at the German painters who were called, the term realist sort of comes up. In France, you hear about Courbet. In Germany, you hear about really Adolf Menzel, also Leibel, but and these artists in a highly realistic but beautifully finished style took up a lot of what we might today call social subjects or comments on society. This one is called Another Marguerite, which, because thank goodness for Google, because I didn't know what another Marguerite might mean, although it looks like what? What does it look like? What? A tart, thank you. Yes, that's a nice word for it. This is, it's supposedly in a railway carriage, which I think or either in a waiting room. This is a young woman who has fallen from grace. Marguerite was apparently a code name for a prostitute in Valencian. So he would have used that term. There are two civil guards in the back, which, this brings up all sorts of questions. Is he condemning this woman? Is she repentant? Is she dejected? What has happened to her life? The guards look, basically like they're going to do their job, even if it's picking up this poor woman with a small bundle there and taking her to jail. There's certainly a good deal of social comment here. I ran across a quote by the extraordinary filmmaker Luis Buñuel, 20th century Spanish filmmaker. You may know some of his films, The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie, among others. But he said, growing up in Spain at the time, he was born about 1900, it was like being in the Middle Ages. The state of control of the Catholic Church, and it's almost feudal power over the country. And I think you see that here. I'll just, this is a painting by Menzel from a bit earlier in the 1850s, but something that Sorolla would have seen. This is the convoluted title of After Spending Overnight in a Railway Carriage. Let's assume these two fairly young people do not know each other, but this woman is trying to avoid the fact that someone has been drinking all night and has sort of, his entire rear end is in her seat. So this is, couldn't be more specific. Also sort of a commentary that she basically has to put up with this. And on the right, it's a little hard to see here, but the gentleman in the top hat ringing the bell is who? Yes, thank you. The last caller, so to speak. This was sort of Menzel's take on society in many ways, but something that really had an influence on Sorolla. Now, for something completely different, also in the 90s, and into the turn of the century, of course, he became well known for the images we might more fully associate with Sorolla, often called the painter of light, because he has such extraordinary powers. Valencia is, of course, the portion of Spain on the eastern coast, which is a gorgeous coastline where the rich and the not so rich would go to bathe, literally to bathe if they had no baths at home. But also there become, certainly by the turn of the century or into the teens and 20s, had become many fashionable resorts there. But these are these flat-bottomed boats, which in an extraordinary, and there are other ways to close-ups, but they were brought in and out of the water by cattle, which was quite a maneuver, but they were these shallow bottom boats that they had to bring in that way. Are those horses? I think.
That looks like a cow.
Yeah, there's another picture of them. Look, I'm pressing my phone. This is, of course, fishermen with these basket nets, sort of seining for fish. Just extraordinary paintings like this. And these are all good scale, almost as, well, I would say it's just about at the size of the screen. This is mending the nets, and you sort of think of what Buñuel said about, medieval in a way. I mean, the industrial age has not hit here. But these beautiful, beautiful light-struck paintings. So this is what he became more and more known for. Here are the big boys pulling the poles, taking that boat in, I guess. No, coming out, going in, a little hard to tell. He does return to a social subject, you might say. This is from 1899. It did go on to win an international award. Of course, he was exhibiting like Sargent, like Whistler, like Zorn, like Chase, all over Europe. This is called The Inheritance of Sin. Another painting you kind of have to unpack a bit, but this is certainly the ponderous black-robed presence of the church. These were children, no doubt, orphans. They might have been born syphilitic. I think it's said that the ones with the crutches had a polio outbreak there in Spain at that time. So the inheritance of sin, certainly not condemning the children in that sense, but the fact that these children would have been abandoned and basically raised by the church.
Knowing what we know now.
Yes, exactly. Particularly harrowing. Yeah, one hopes it wasn't the case. But it's an extraordinary picture. It's even bigger than that screen. People were moved by it, whether they thought this was the church saving the children, whether they would have condemned the parent, whatever one's feelings might have been upon seeing this, one was very touched and connected with and had feelings about what was going on there. So in 1899, and the World Prize, I think it was shown at the Paris Universal Exhibition in 1900, and then on the basis of that sort of, and this slide is a little bit out of order, so let me just come back there. Speaking of how attached he was to his wife, here's a little painting he made for her and sent to her from a trip. He says, to my dear Clotilde. I'm going to just keep in mind this painting, the fact that it was at this international exposition, and we'll just go on to a little bit about performance and costuming and dressing up and Velázquez and all those things that both Chase and Sorolla loved to do, loved to paint. On the left of Sorolla's two daughters. One of the girls has sort of dressed as a boy there with the pants, with this wonderful decorated horse. Yes. On the right is a painting that he did of a famous actress. Sorolla painted this famous actress. And as you can see, that is very much like, of course, the Infanta Margaret Teresa in Las Meninas, the famous picture of the Spanish court, which I'll show in a minute. But copying a painting or doing a copy after a painting was just part of what you did as a student. It's also part of what you might do if a collector wanted to see one. Oh, I seem to have the same one there. Excuse me. This is the family at home. That's Clotilde and Maria and Elena and the young boy. They had the three children. And there's one of his many portraits of his wife. She was beautiful. And we find with Chase, people always say, well, which children are in the paintings by Chase? And I said, well, it's generally the three. The oldest daughter, Alice, the next daughter was never to be found in a painting or a photograph for that matter. She just said no and went the other way. That was Koto, who had a mind of her own. And then Dorothy and Helen were the next daughters, and they would often and frequently and really were the most represented in the paintings that he did and all their costumes. And I remember something that Fairfield Porter's son once said, because he is the child, or the son certainly, who is most representative in Porter's paintings. And Lawrence always said it was because he felt closer to his father when he would, be asked to pose. He was happy to be that. And I think maybe all children, because these painters were, peripatetic. They were always going somewhere at a point in their youth. So I think for all, maybe the children, it meant they could have more time with their father. And certainly Clotilde, this is kind of Clotilde through the ages. She's obviously older in the far right, but was a very willing subject. Now on the left is Las Meninas from 1642, the probably most famous painting in the Prado, certainly Velázquez's most famous painting, and there's the Infanta front and center, Marguerite Teresa, and she's surrounded, of course, by people of the court. Las Meninas, which technically means the bridesmaids, are on the left and the right of her attendants. That's Velázquez with that very big canvas in front of him. He's on the far left here. Very big canvas. And that's good because it's like the Mona Lisa. Everybody goes to the Prado and stands in front of this. You can't get anywhere near it, right? In the back, you see a figure, silhouetted, who is apparently a court attendant, and then in that black square, the mirror, are Margaret Teresa's parents, the king and queen, overseeing. So this trope of the painter looking at the viewer looking at the scene, the mirror, the reflection in the mirror, all these things are often picked up by other artists, other painters. On the right, you see that lovely family picture, but who's reflected there? On the right, upper right. Yeah, Sorolla, of course, painting. I think that's such a lovely painting. It's an obvious homage, particularly with the littlest girl there in the front in the sort of dazzling white. She's a stand-in for the Infanta. Just it's a lovely picture, I think. Well, here we go. I ran across this image, seeing St. Louis. It's funny, Sargent went to Europe. Both Sargent and Whistler basically left for Europe and never really came back. They followed the money, so to speak. You might say Sorolla did too, because he became wildly popular with collectors in the U.S., one collector specifically. But so there was a painting, a show that traveled from Buffalo, there you are, to Chicago, to St. Louis, of about 200 of Sorolla's works. That's a big show, right? I often think it's amazing how we ship paintings around, but it was even more amazing in those days, so to speak. So they're in this sort of little setup photograph. The artist in the person in the back is Cadwallader or Washburn. Not a name that comes easily to mind, except for the fact that he was a Chase student at Shinnecock and was a portrait done by Chase. He came from a wealthy St. Louis family, and he was an interesting painter. He never sort of made the big time, but it's interesting. He was there to greet Sorolla in St. Louis. And this absolutely beautiful painting. This is a later painting, 1910. Again, it is the family. You see Clotilde there has a cane to walk on the sand, not surprising, but she has this extraordinary, headscarf on that's obviously caught the ocean breeze. Maria, the younger daughter, turns to look at the viewer, and And there's the older daughter with her binoculars looking out to the sea, sort of a beautiful composite of all these, of a very simple scene. This also happens to have been done at, I have to look at it, Zorats. Apparently it's the northern Valencian shore. I don't know that name. It's rather like Biarritz or something. It became the very most popular beach resort at that time. So again, Sorolla is going where he knows the patrons are. And indeed, this painting was in the show and kept, it's at the St. Louis Art Museum. It was bought then. So I mentioned patrons, just a couple more of these extraordinary paintings he did of her. On the left is a copy of a Velázquez, another Infanta that Sorolla had done. On the right is Clotilde as a Spanish señorita. And again, the paintings for which he became very well known. So, speaking of patrons, he was sort of discovered by, well, let's go back. Does the name Archer Huntington ring bells with anyone? You know, the museum in Pasadena? Another fashionable watering hole, yes. Huh? What?
No, I didn't know his name was Archer. I thought it was different.
Oh. I think I'm right. Huntington, who is a collector who had early on the family business was railroads and shipping, so they were very well off. They had a home on Long Island as well, out sort of more Gold Coast, but he was able to pretty much indulge his penchant for collecting. I think he must have read something like El Cid or something as a kid. He was totally enraptured by Spain, everything about Spain, every legend, every story, every prince. Had this extraordinary library. Pasadena, which he did later, is an extraordinary botanical garden, which has a lot of sort of cactus type area, like the climates of Spain. At any rate, he went head over heels for Sorolla. He sort of planned this tour of America that he did, those paintings, and to that end, he had already started something called the Hispanic Society, which, has anyone ever been there up on the upper Manhattan? Yeah, great. I have been there. When I was there, the Sorolla murals were out being redone, and I have never gotten back, but I understand they're beautiful. He brought, and this is 1909, he brought Sorolla there, discussed with him doing a mural series about, well, I think probably Sorolla was the one who suggested that he take on various scenes of areas of Spain. Again, this would probably have been looking back to more colorful times again. Andalusia, Aragon, Castilla y León, and of course Valencia. So these are some of the murals that he painted. He went back home with, I'm sure, a pocket full of cash from Mr. Huntington, went back to Madrid and began to paint. There he is on the steps, and also another inside. It's a beautiful building, and this whole series of murals that he painted, and of course were later shipped here to New York with the various scenes which you can see. Of course, the horse here looks very much like the one in the costume painting of the girls, the daughters, right? And again, it's not, I mean, it was recapturing a time that probably was not the climate in that, not as though it was in present day Spain. It was really an idea of sort of recapturing the past histories. So this was open to great acclaim. Huntington bought one painting from Sorolla. I remember reading that had a price tag of $600,000. This is, of course, pre-tax days, but still, before the IRS was invented, but still, I mean, we are talking about enormous sums of money that were exchanged for this kind of, the stature of this kind of work. Just a reprise for a moment, this is a painting that Chase did. This is in the Prado, so he would have done it in back when he was back in Spain traveling after Munich, so I think it's mid-'80s. It's Velázquez in the Prado of Pablo de Valladolid, who was a jester. Now, not all jesters were tiny, but he was an entertainer at the court and at the court of Philip. So he was, can you tell which one is Velázquez and which one is Chase? The color notwithstanding, because that could be off. The left is, you're right. Why'd you say it? I mean, what struck you about that?
The palette. I think the palette.
Yeah, as I say, the palette may be a bit off color. I mean, I don't know, but you're right. That's true too.
And then you say the Manet as well, I mean.
Yes, of course you do. Yes. I mean, it's to me the left. The face is much more expressive in some sort of, maybe I'm reading into that all jesters, all clowns are crying inside, but no, that may not be the case, but I think it does look more
It looks like it was drawn from life, whereas the one on the right looks like it's
copied. That's a good point, Helen, yeah. Interesting. So we should fast forward here to is another painting of Velázquez on the right of the Infanta. She had a lot of pretty dresses, didn't she? Can you imagine? What should she be there? 3.5, 4, getting her into that rig? That's amazing. Maybe she just wanted to go play outside. But on the left is a painting which Chase painted after an evening of tableau vivant at Shinnecock. This was done at Shinnecock at the school. They would meet on some evenings or to have these parties with tableau vivant. Now, tableau vivant is just what you see, someone costumed and standing in a frame, so that you get this idea, tableau vivant, living pictures, they say. Still a good game. We don't have much time to dress up and do this sort of thing anymore. Must play video games, but this is what went on for an evening there. So there she is. There's little Helen, another willing co-conspirator there. And there's Chase, actually. She must be on a table, and he's holding up the frame, I think, probably. And this would last for several minutes. Often you would have some sort of makeshift curtain, and then the curtains would part, and you would see this image. There you see him later working on a painting of the subject, because one of the, a visitor, also, you read of the, some of the classes that were held, or some, it was sort of open to the public, and people knew it would be great fun and fashionable to go to Shinnecock, to the studio building, and perhaps, kibitz on one of these evenings. And a woman there who had some means, I guess, she commissioned Chase to paint the portrait on the left, which I think is hysterical. And there it is. It is, and you're going to ask me, it is apparently owned by someone in Europe. Now, the little painting of Helen. Chase had his own homage to Velázquez. Most painters of that period did, but, and this is the front hall at Shinnecock. As you can see, he and Mrs. Chase were great collectors as well of vases and bright, shiny things. This is early on. The girls, those are the two oldest girls. They're fairly little, or maybe the two middle girls, actually, if they're that size. But what's interesting is the front door is just beyond the windows that you see. There's the front door. And then you look to the back, which is a big old Dutch called a kast, just a big cabinet. But it's glass fronted, so that what's in the reflection? In the glass, the painter, yeah, which is an evident nod to Las Meninas and that sort of play with the foreground and background. That's from 1892. So that would have been their first summer. I guess that is Alice and maybe Koto. And you get this twice because it's here twice. Again, back to Sorolla's homage. Am I going the wrong way here? The Chase family was also I don't have too many other pictures of Sorolla's family really in costume, but tons of the Chase family, mainly because we have a wonderful archive of over 400 photographs taken by the family and friends, and also by Mrs. Chase herself. So here she is, these are all from Shinnecock. There she is on the great staircase in Shinnecock, which sort of rises up from the room that you saw. You can probably see it there. No, it's just out of sight on the right. But and there were two little boys. The three youngest children were two boys and a girl, and the little boys, well, the little boy on the left is the king, maybe King Arthur, who knows. On the right is actually the older son. That the little boy on the left is Dana, the youngest one. And then on the right is just a moment. The youngest boy, and also one of the daughters, Helen, and they've dressed up as the princes in the tower. I mean, this was what children used to read, actually sort of gruesome, but at least fairy tales from the English kings. That's Sir John Mallet's painting of the kings, who are, of course, little Edward and Richard, the ill-fated sons of Edward IV, whom their evil uncle seems to have done them in. Richard III, who will, of course, live in infamy thanks to Mr. Shakespeare. Did I say Richard III? Yes, sorry. All right, so much dressing up, much costuming, much performative evenings with the Chase family. And this is the last slide. It's sort of irresistible when talking about this. You may notice the pearls that Mrs. Chase was wearing are now on Dorothy on the left. And that's Alice, the oldest daughter, on the right. These are quite elaborate. They became, by 1910, into the teens, Chase became probably the best-known artist who was staging them. He obviously did it sometimes for remuneration. He also did it quite often as fundraisers. There were fundraisers for the Red Cross for the First World War that he and some of the students worked on with. So I think they were, the family was often, and students were often active in these evenings. That's the great Empress Theodora there. I might have seemed a little all over the place. I wanted to give you some feeling for both of these artists in the ways they were very much alike and also very different in a way. Sorolla died quite young. We spoke about the trip to it actually took him about 10 years to finish the murals for Huntington, for the Hispanic Society. He had a heart attack shortly after that, and that would be shortly after these paintings here in the museum that we graciously have been loaned to us. Shortly after that, 1919, and in 1920 he had the stroke, and he really never recovered. He didn't paint anymore. So that would have made him 60 years old, which was not, too young, but, he would have expected to go on and be very successful in this career, particularly his renown, really, in the States, particularly in the Midwest. And, of course, Huntington brought his paintings to Pasadena, his last, as I said, the last great watering hole there on the West Coast that he lived in. But it's been very interesting to me to think about the ways that they were similar, had like ideas, and I think I just go back to, and what might also be said of Vicente, which sort of begs the comparison with Sorolla, is their love for the art, family, and the garden. So we'll talk about that next week. Any questions, I'd be glad to answer. Thank you.